This week, I'm actually really excited about this. Nathan Sanders has been my collaborator, I think, over a year now. I'm doing a lot of thinking about AI and democracy. And
very shocking, but it's closer to 4 years.
Is it really?
Yeah.
I don't even believe that. I'm going to check while he's talking. And so Nathan to talk about AI and democracy. And I always learn a lot actually when I hear him talk. So I'm really excited to hear this. So you know the drill. We'll talk for maybe 40 or so minutes, and we'll have time for questions. And hi to everybody on Zoom. If you have questions, type in the chat, and they get to us somehow. So, all right, go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really, truly a privilege to be in dialogue with all of you. I'm really grateful to Bruce, to Liz, for everyone who's helped organize. I'm just thrilled to be part of the conversation with you. I'll speak for about 30, 35 minutes, and then I'm eager to get into discussion with you all. And as Bruce said, I'm going to be talking about the many interactions of AI democracy. And we have been working on this for a while now. I've given a few different versions of the talk on this subject. And I do really benefit from AI when I'm giving this talk. And the reason is that I have absolutely no artistic ability, but I do like to have illustrations when I'm giving a talk. And I just love AI image generators, text to image generators for this purpose. So a few years ago, I used the original version of DALL-E, the OpenAI text image generator, to try and illustrate the theme of this talk. And you know, it's cartoony, it's a little silly, it's a little wonky. I like it. It's much better than I can do. But these models have continued to improve. And so about a year ago, when DALL-E 2 was publicly released, I tried this again. I used basically the same prompts to generate a new version of this illustration. And I don't know how you all feel, but I was really impressed. I feel like it's much better. And so now there's a DALL-E 3. And I tried this again just a few days ago. And you can be the first people to see the new illustration. And I think it's really quite impressive how these models have improved. So this is, frivolous. This, image generators are not the subject of this talk. But for me, it's just an illustration of how useful these capabilities can be to augment the scope of each of our own individual abilities. I think I'm good at lots of things. I'm definitely not good at art. And it's great to have tools like this to help augment. Okay. So who am I? I'm a data scientist. I was a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center a few years ago, which is how I met Bruce. But my background is in all sorts of different areas, including science and policy and applications of machine learning in industry. I got started working in policy right here at HKS. When I was a PhD student in the Department of Astronomy at Harvard, I did a Rappaport Fellowship, the center that's right downstairs. And I took that to the Massachusetts State House. I worked with a couple of fantastic state legislators. It was a transformative experience. And so ever since then, I've been really thinking about how to apply technology to public policy making, particularly at the state level in the US. And that's influenced a lot of the thinking that I'll share today. Bruce, of course, has been my fantastic collaborator and co-author who I've learned an enormous amount from doing this work. We've thought a lot together about all the different ways that AI is trying to impact democracy and how we think it may impact democracy over time. And we've written lots about this, which has led us to developing the book, as Bruce mentioned. We don't have a title yet. We're working on it. I'd love your feedback. Here are two options. We may call it AI and the New Future of Democracy, or Rewiring the Republic, How AI Will Transform Our Politics, Government, and Citizenship. And please look for it next year from MIT Press. But regardless of what we call it, what we're trying to do is map out the interactions that we see already happening between these two entities, AI and democratic government, and how that's going to change over time. And there are many interactions. There's one that a lot of us have been thinking a lot about over the last couple of years, which is regulation, democratic government exerting control over the development of AI systems. And this is very important, but this is just one of many interactions. Another important interaction is assistive capabilities, using AI to augment, improve, and assist the functioning of government. And we think that's really important too. And I'll share some examples that I think are really promising about what that can look like. Another way democratic government can influence AI is not just regulating what corporate players do, but also directly supporting, directly intervening, directly creating AI models through what we call public AI. And I'll talk more about that also. And then on top of all this, of course, there are an enormous number of risks and challenges posed to democratic governance by the existence of AI models. And we hear a lot about this as well. We hear about deepfakes and misinformation spreading during campaign season. These are very real issues, but I think they're just a slice of this much larger cake of interactions between the democratic government and AI. And of course, what we'd all like to do is maximize the assistive benefits of AI's impacts on democracy and mitigate its risks. In order to understand how to do that, we need to think of democratic governance not just as a monolith, but as many interacting systems. Because we all know government is complex. There are many actors within it. There are many democracies around the world. All of them are going to interact individually with AI, and there will be interactions between them. And that's what we want to understand. So we have a whole book, but today I'm just going to take a brief survey of topics from the book. And I'm going to focus on what we think are some of the most interesting potential second-order impacts of AI on democratic governance. So what I mean by that is that today we're already seeing the first-order impacts. We're seeing the first ways that AI is impacting different aspects of democratic governance. And we're trying to project forward to figure out where does that lead? How do those impacts compound? And what are the second-order effects? And I think this is important, even though it's speculative. We don't know what these outcomes will be yet. We don't know what the second-order effects will be. But by imagining the different types of second-order effects that could arise, we can collectively try and steer towards the future we think is most beneficial. So to me, that's the purpose of doing this work. And I'll conclude my talk today by trying to recommend some of what I think are the important ways to do that. Okay, so our book is in 6 parts. We have an introduction, and then we have sections on politics, legislation, administration, courts, and citizenship, what we think of as kind of the 5 pillars of democratic society. For the interest of time, I'm going to walk you through a brief survey of 4 of these topics, and we can leave citizenship for another day. But I'll start with second-order impacts in politics. So one impact I think we're already starting to see is the transformation of how campaigning is done by integrating AI tools. For example, the use of campaign avatars. So I think the first and maybe so far the most impactful use case comes from South Korea, where the current sitting South Korean president gained elected office by using an AI avatar. He made a model called AI Yoon. It was a very prominent feature of his campaign. Millions of people interacted with this model. I don't think anyone believes that is the reason that he was elected by any means, but it was a significant part of how he chose to interact with voters. And it seemed to gather a lot of attention and really spread throughout other candidates in South Korea. And maybe this is something like what we can expect the future of democracy to be campaigning to look like in that country and elsewhere. We already are seeing similar approaches taken in other places. So just this summer in Tokyo, there was a candidate who was virtually unknown, a 33-year-old guy who used an AI avatar to do a continuous live stream on YouTube for 17 days, where anyone could ask an AI version of this candidate questions and get an answer. And more than 8,000 questions were asked of this avatar. This candidate did not win, but an unknown 33-year-old guy came in 5th out of 56 candidates for governor of Tokyo. I think it's illustrative of how people are really interested in engaging with politicians in this new way. This is happening in the US too. We have examples from the congressional primaries last year, candidates like Shemaine Daniels and others who used AI robocallers. So if you live in her district, you might have gotten a call, not from a campaign volunteer, not a pre-recorded voice message, but an interactive voice AI chatbot who would offer to answer questions about her campaign, her platform, and the issues. So I think we can expect more of that in the future. And the question is, what will the second-order impacts be of more and more campaigning happening through these types of chatbots? And I think one natural future direction is lowering the barrier to campaigning. We're already seeing the whole ecosystem that exists in this country and elsewhere of political consultants trying to rapidly embrace these kinds of technologies, trying to leverage AI in their own platforms and capabilities and services. We see startups springing up around ways to integrate AI for fundraising, for messaging, even for campaign strategy. One of the use cases that we've looked at particularly, and Bruce and I have had the pleasure to work with lots of students at HKS and Harvard, including Lucas and Zubair, who are here with us today, and Aaron Gong and Aaron Berger, who have led some of this work. We've experimented with the use of AI models, particularly large language models, to recapitulate the results that you can expect from public polling, from surveying humans. This is not a replacement for humans, but it's a statistical measurement tool similar to the measurement tools that are used in survey research to account for underrepresentation or to leverage data from social media alongside public polling data. I think will be increasingly useful to campaigns as they try and rapidly get information about the electorate and anticipate people's responses to new questions in a way that can happen much faster than fielding a representative survey in the field, which is getting increasingly challenging and increasingly costly. And we're already seeing startups spring up trying to commercialize this capability. Okay, so if it becomes easier to run for office, if the barrier is lower, if there are more technological capabilities that help people with machinery of campaigns without having to have large staffs and volunteer bases, it could cause more people to run for office, and that could have many consequences. It could potentially empower disempowered communities who may not otherwise have the resources to mount a campaign from within their community. It could also put a spotlight on candidates that would otherwise be serving a niche that's too small to mount a campaign. That could be good, that could be bad. It could mean more fringe candidates getting the opportunity to campaign and supporting the electorate. It can also further divide and polarize the electorate. We have a choice in how this outcome goes. There are good outcomes and there are bad outcomes, and we can steer towards the beneficial ones. And I think the types of policies that might help us react to an electorate where there are increasing numbers of candidates who can mount an effective campaign would look like reforms like this: ranked choice voting, proportional representation, media capabilities that help voters sift through an increasingly large slates of candidates. Like, by the way, we saw Tokyo, where they had 56 candidates running for governor. So note, these reforms are not specific to AI, and that's important, and that's the point. They're not specific to AI, but they are responsive to the challenges created by AI automation, giving more people more capabilities to interact with the democratic process. So that's politics. I want to talk about legislation next. Legislation is going to be impacted in several ways by AI. I want to start by talking about how it can help with engaged constituents, and then how AI can write law. So with respect to engaging constituents, this is something my collaborators and I have really embraced. We've been developing a platform called Maple, the Massachusetts Platform for Legislative Engagement. We're online at mapletestimony.org, you can check it out. And our goal is not related to AI. Our goal is to build a platform that makes it super easy for anyone in Massachusetts to submit testimony to our legislature. We're just trying to make the process of legislative engagement easier and to help more people do it. But as part of that goal, we found it really valuable to integrate AI-assisted tools. We've been using AI to help organize legislation. There are thousands of bills filed per year. How does a person figure out what policies are relevant for them? We're using it to help translate and summarize legislation so that people who are not trained lawyers can understand the policies in 100-page long bills full of legalese. And we're also using it to help people who are not native English speakers engage with a legislative process that in this state is 100% done in English. We have fantastic collaborators in Europe, make.org, who are using AI for another purpose. They really specialize in organizing citizen assemblies, these huge online forums, deliberative forums of sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. And they're finding AI really useful for this as well. They use AI moderators to help facilitate conversation and to help people summarize and access what thousands of other people are saying all at the same time. So I think these are exciting use cases showing how AI can support better policymaking and also make it more participatory. And next I want to talk about AI written law. This is something we are now seeing happening. It was last year that we saw the first known law written by AI passed, the first bill written by AI passed into law. This happened in Brazil. And for Bruce and I, this was really exciting because just a few months prior to that, we had outlined what we saw as an overarching strategy for using AI in legislative policymaking. And our thinking started with drafting legislative text using LLMs. That's a very expected use case. But also going beyond that, thinking about how other types of AI models can influence the legislative process. We're thinking about how you can use predictive models to predict the outcomes, the social outcomes of different policies, how you can plan legislative strategies by using graph learning models to understand political networks, and how you can try and influence those networks in an optimal way if you're trying to get a bill passed. And we had in mind for this, hopefully public interested uses, but also awareness that corporate lobbyists and people who are looking to manipulate legislative processes not for the public interest might use these tools as well. I think France is arguably the first government that's actually invested in developing these kinds of capabilities for their legislature. The French government fine-tuned an LLM for use by its legislative staff. And we've already seen in both the US House at the federal level and the EU Parliament trying to empower their legislative staffs with tools like this as well. And I expect we'll see more. There are also now startups and companies that are creating and commercializing tools like this. There are lots of these, but I think this one, Legislate, is particularly interesting because they're focusing at the local level. They're recognizing that it's often local level legislators who don't have the capacity and support to draft legislation on their own that can really benefit from these kinds of automating capabilities. So what would it mean to have increasing amounts of law written by AI? I think one surprising consequence of that could actually be a weaker executive branch, and I'll explain why. The type of law written by AI could become different than the type of law we're used to humans writing. It could be more complex because AI models can have a great scope. Each of us as people can have a handful of specializations, but legislators are responsible for making policy on every issue. And LLMs can be trained across a much broader range of content areas. Now, AI written law does not have to be more complex because AI are inherently more complex writers. It doesn't have to be more complex because complexity is better. I don't think that's the case. But I think it will be more complex because there is legislative demand for more complex law. And AI is a tool capable of filling that demand. So I'll make the argument for why I think that is. And I'll start with evidence from US state level legislation. This is a survey from several years ago where they looked at bills introduced in states throughout the country, and they tried to explain which bills were wholly original text versus which bills borrowed from previous legislation in other states or from model legislation. And the answer is not very surprising. The answer is that the legislators who borrow the most text, who need the most help with drafting, are the ones not from professionalized legislatures. If you're from a legislature where you're part-time or don't have a lot of staff, you rely more on external supports to draft legislation. That's not surprising, and it creates a demand for drafting bills. This is a more recent study. I think it's even more interesting because Schaefer developed a methodology for measuring complexity of a bill. The way it works is that they identify all these interacting systems that are defined in the bill, and then they measure the complexity of that network. I think it's really clever. And then they did a regression to evaluate what are the factors that lead to laws being introduced that are more complex, bills being introduced that are more complex. This is at the US federal level. And they pointed to two things. One is that ideological polarization drives complexity. If you're a legislator that's on the more extreme end of the dominant ideological spectrum, you're more likely to introduce a complex law. And the second is divided government. If you're in Congress and there's a member of the opposite party in the White House, you don't want to leave them an inch of wiggle room. You want to tell them exactly what to do. You want to leave them with less discretion, and you write more complex legislation. And so I think this illustrates a demand for complex legislation that will grow because these two factors are increasingly entrenched at the US federal level. We have greater ideological polarization. We have more often divided government. So this interacts with an inherent power imbalance, which is that when the law is more specific, that means the legislature is choosing to delegate less to the executive branch, and it increases the power of the legislature. And the legislature is really the one with the control over this. They get to decide when to delegate and when not to. But more complex legislation comes with the cost of the discretion of the executive. And everyone in this room knows there's one more factor that's really going to drive this in the US going forward, which is the overturning just a few months ago of Chevron doctrine by the Supreme Court. All of a sudden, there is a literal mandate from the Supreme Court that legislation has to get more specific. Things that have historically been left implicitly to the executive branch are now required to be either made explicit delegations or to be specified directly in statute. This is going to supercharge the demand for complex legislation, and we know that legislators across the country need support in drafting texts, and I think it's natural to turn to AI to do that. Okay, next we'll talk about administration, where I think the first order impact of AI will be automating enforcement of law. And I'll go further than that in a minute. Automated enforcement is not new. We've had technologies for automating enforcement long before modern AI models. We've had speed trap cameras, we've had red light cameras, we've had breathalyzer tests. And these are often effective enforcement mechanisms, but they're not necessarily desirable enforcement mechanisms, and there's often a lot of resistance to them, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. So here's a really good reason to resist automated enforcement. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this UK post office scandal that's unfolded over the last few years. This is a case where the UK government relied on reports from an accounting software tool called Horizon and used it to wrongfully accuse and ultimately convict 700 postal workers of financial fraud. It's really a tragic case. This was not an AI tool, but I think it demonstrates why there's inherent resistance to the idea of automating enforcement and relying on machines to do so. And I think it's completely legitimate. Here in Massachusetts, organizations like ACLU Mass have made this state a leader in resisting automated enforcement in several areas. For example, many of our communities right here around Cambridge have passed laws banning the use of facial recognition AI in law enforcement. And I think for very good reasons, because there's evident risk of bias and racial discrimination in these facial recognition systems. So this makes sense. Also in Massachusetts, this state, like several others, has banned the use of automated traffic enforcement. We don't have speed cameras. We don't have red light cameras in the state because we've chosen not to. I think there's a pretty good argument that maybe things would be safer if Massachusetts drivers didn't run red lights constantly, which we do. I come from Michigan. People in other states don't do that. In Massachusetts, we've chosen that we want to keep doing this. People don't want to get tickets when they run a red light. And we're a democratic society and we can make that choice. But it's, I think, maybe not as good a reason as the others. Okay. What's interesting about AI is that it allows us to extend those automated enforcement capabilities further than the types of examples we've looked at so far. The example of the speed camera is useful for enforcing a simple rule. You can have a radar, it can measure if you go over 60 miles an hour. You can take a picture of the license plate. A person could put a fee in the mail to a person who breaks that rule. You don't need AI. But if you want to enforce a more complex standard, like a standard for reckless driving, that is not directly measurable, but relies on some judgment, you need to go beyond the capabilities of a piece of technology like a radar gun. You need a technology that's capable of interpretation. You need a human, or you need perhaps an AI tool to do that. Okay, the capabilities that we've talked about so far have been focused on law enforcement, but they apply to regulatory enforcement too. And that's where I think some of the most interesting second order effects will come from. I think we could see what you can think of as a regulatory decoupling happen as AI is introduced more and more into regulation. So I'll explain what that means. In the US and elsewhere, we have far more rules, administrative laws on the books than we can possibly enforce. The average number of pages added to the Federal Register each year is like 100,000 pages. And you can talk to people in any industry and they'll tell you that some of these rules are rigorously enforced and many of them are not. That in some ways is a choice about budgets and staffing and the force that we put behind executive agencies. Historically, there's been a coupling between our investment in staffing for enforcement and regulatory outcomes. So a lot of my work has been focused on environmental regulation in Massachusetts, and we see this here very directly. This is a chart, it's a few years old now, but it's tracking the number of employees at our State Department of Environmental Protection. And you can see it's oscillated by what I think are remarkable amounts, factors of 2 and 3x change in the number of staff we hire at DEP over the years. And if you compare that to the number of regulatory enforcement actions the agency takes, they go up and down almost in lockstep with each other. There's an 82% correlation. There's a strong coupling between our investment in enforcement, the humans that we hire to enforce administrative law, and the regulatory outcomes that we achieve. So automation is really interesting in this complex context, because if we could increase the productivity of a fixed number of staff, we might be able to have the same budget and increase enforcement. We might be able to break this coupling between enforcement and regulation. And I think there's some really interesting demonstrations of this, particularly in the environmental space. This is a study where they use machine learning models to propose a new way to prioritize site visits for enforcement, to prioritize inspections. What they show is that ML models using data about facilities are pretty good at identifying which sites are likely to fail inspection and probably should be inspected more frequently, and which ones are not and maybe don't need to be inspected as frequently. So from an efficiency standpoint, this is exciting. It also has justice implications because you want to make sure your enforcement ideally is universal, but if it's not, you don't want it to be selective against one community or another. So there are important considerations in how to use a technology like this, but I think it demonstrates that capability of decoupling enforcement activity from budgets. Okay, now for this to be effective, it is not good enough for the AI models to be useful and effective and have high performance. That's not good enough. The models also have to be trustworthy so that both agencies and the citizens that empower them will agree to use them for that use case. And there has to be political will. Going back to the point about resisting enforcement, those same arguments apply to regulatory enforcement as well as law enforcement. There has to be a political will to use the technologies in this way. Okay, the last topic I'll talk about is the courts, where we see AI being used to interpret law in an automated way. This is interesting because using machine learning model, using AI tools to interpret law allows legal interpretation to be more predictable than it is when you rely on a diverse group of humans to do it. AI models can take as input the text of legislation and context like evidence from the real world and maybe testimony that was given to the legislature at the time that they wrote the law. All this information just as a human judge would and make a decision. There's an industry springing up here too. I'm sure a lot of you have seen tons of legal AI startups. There's just an enormous number of them today. And we don't know yet what the impact of these will be. We don't know how useful lawyers will find them. We don't know how often they'll be used in the future, but they're certainly being invested in. And we already see legal scholars specifically trying to understand the abilities of AI models to interpret legislation and how well that aligns to human interpretation. And the results are mixed. In some cases, it does pretty well. In some cases, it doesn't. It is getting better, and we'll have to see where that goes. But there are also scholars, including Jack, who's I know an HLS student, who are thinking about what are the consequences of adopting a predictive technology that can automate interpretation of law. And I think those potential consequences are really interesting because there is one group of people who should be really excited about the idea of a mechanical, automated interpretation of law that's standard and the same everywhere. In fact, we have a huge legal movement in this country and elsewhere that's focused on doing exactly that and has been for decades, the textualist movement. And now, if you're part of that movement, you have a tool available that can literally make the interpretation of law mechanical. So I think an interesting example of this comes from Florida, where at the start of the pandemic, they had a choice, or there was a legal question about whether or not existing statutes on sanitation would allow for the government to enforce a mask mandate. And a judge had to face this question. What does the word sanitation mean? Does it encompass the idea of wearing masks or not? And this judge, like some others have turned to technological tools to try and answer that question. This is a few years ago. It was before a lot of the modern AI tools that people are excited about today. And the tool she turned to was not an AI tool necessarily, but a linguistic database. And her answer was, no, you don't have to have a mask mandate. Sanitation doesn't imply that the government can enforce a mask mandate. So this is an example of how a textualist judge would like to use automated interpretive capabilities for law. And the question is this really what textualists are after, or maybe is it more of a justification than a methodology that they're seeking? But regardless how you think about that, there are consequences of having interpretive capabilities, both for judges and, I think even more interestingly, for the legislative branch. I think the existence of automated tools for interpreting law could change how law is made. So to understand this, I like to use a silly metaphor, which is that the job of the legislator is simply impossible, because what they have to do is do telepathy. They have to transition their state of mind, share their state of mind with the judge or with a law enforcement officer, not just today, but also 100 years from now. They have to do telepathy to a time machine, and that's impossible. And the only tool that they have to do this is writing words on a page. Written law is the tool that they have to transition their state of mind, their legislative intent, to someone else across the country 100 years from now. So the opportunity for legislators is to take the guesswork out of that, to have more control, more expressive control in writing law by encoding law as an AI model than they could with the written word alone. So I'm going to come back to Massachusetts again for an example of this. Are people familiar with this Qdoba case? This is from about a decade ago in Massachusetts. There was a sandwich shop in Worcester, Mass. It may seem odd that we're talking about this, but this sandwich shop went out of business or something. They're going to be replaced by a Qdoba restaurant, which is a Mexican restaurant that does not sell sandwiches as you would traditionally conceive of them, but they do sell burritos. So there's a question of contract law. Does this burrito shop get to follow all the same rules that were established for the sandwich shop, or does it have to follow different rules? And here again, a judge had to decide what is the meaning of the word sandwich. And someone had sat down and written out rules for sandwiches, and they had not written anything about this case. And they don't get to go back in time and change what they wrote. But if they had an AI model intervening to represent their legislative intent, they could have written something more expressive. They could have created something more expressive that could answer those types of questions. So what does that look like? If you're a legislator and you have access to an AI model that you can save and persist, you could write into law that in the future, judges or law enforcement officers have to consult that AI to get an answer to a question about an edge case. You could build that model and inform it with all the information that you considered or your committee considered when writing law. You could give it access to all the briefs that you read, all the testimony you received. And the process of legislative drafting would now look different, because instead of just arguing about words on the page, now you can also do what a software engineer would call assertion checks, unit tests. You could ask questions, pose edge cases to the model, and iterate until you get to the point where all the edge cases you can conceive of are addressed by the model. And that can build your trust that it will work for future edge cases that you haven't thought of yet as well. This is very similar to how machine learning tools are developed today to generalize that domain. Okay, that is our survey of these 5 fields. I want to conclude by talking about what I think this means for us and our choices as a democracy. We don't know if any of these second order effects will happen. Of course, they're speculations, and they definitely don't have to happen, because we can all make choices about how we want to steer the future of our democracy and how it interacts with AI. Almost every application that we've talked about here is a double-edged sword. Bruce and I often think of this in terms of the opportunity to concentrate power or the opportunity to disperse power. I know that was the subject of the last seminar in the series last week. And we get to influence that outcome. We get to pick what direction these technologies are applied in. So I think there are 3 primary ways that we get to influence how these technologies are used in interactive democracy. I'll talk about each one very briefly. First, government can steer the AI ecosystem. We don't have to rely on big tech corporations to develop models that end up being in the public interest. We can, of course, exert control over that through regulation, but the government can also participate in the AI ecosystem. We can develop public AI models that are developed by public agencies for the public interest, with public oversight, with public accountability, with more transparency that has become the norm in the corporate AI industry today. And I think there's a compelling case that this creates better outcomes. It creates universal access to what will be arguably the critical infrastructure of the 21st century. We also have an opportunity to leverage these AI models to make democracy work better. I showed the examples of Maple and Make.org earlier, and I think these are really compelling examples. They show how simple, immediate applications of AI technologies that already exist can have a meaningful impact in making democracy more participatory. And lastly, we can renovate our democracy to prepare it for the impacts of AI. Of course, I'm speaking here at HKS, where the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation is really leading a lot of this work that I think is so exciting. There's an opportunity to strengthen core laws around lobbying disclosure, campaign finance, implementing voting reforms. These are, again, not solutions that are specific to AI, and that's the point. They're responsive to the impacts that AI can have on our democracy. So that's everything I wanted to share with you today, and I'm eager to join you in a conversation. Thank you.